Welcome to the Human Rights Cafe. My name is Jacob Sule. When people's rights are tampered with or denied, it means that my rights and yours are being undermined. Hence, we must educate people about their rights. The Human Rights Cafe is a collaborative virtual conversation of a Right to Live initiative to equip new generation of leaders to know, promote, and protect citizens' rights and dignity of all persons. The conversation seeks to promote human rights, justice, peace, and strong institutions as provided for by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our goal is to build a nation where peace and justice shall reign and respect for citizens' rights. If you'd like to know more about the Human Rights Cafe, please join our conversation on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter via @HRightsCafe. Once again, Jacob Sule. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us from. This is the Human Rights Cafe conversation. My name is Jacob Sule, and I'd like to welcome you to today's chat, streaming live from Washington, D.C. I have with me my colleague from Nigeria who is joining this chat, Joanna.
Hello, everyone. I am Joanna Titus. I'm joining live from Nigeria. Today, I'll be co-hosting with Jacob on the chat.
Thank you so much, Joanna. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. On today's chat today, we have two gentlemen who would speak to us on the impact of COVID-19 on civic space and democracy in West Africa. These gentlemen are very successful legal practice and will join us on this chat today to have this conversation. First, we have Ikechukwu Uzoma. Thank you and welcome to the chat today.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Joanna. It's my pleasure.
We also have Philippe Plagbe. Thank you and welcome to the chat.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, anyone. And very happy to be here with you guys.
Thank you very much. Before we go into the chat, let me briefly introduce my guest. Ikechukwu Uzoma is an international human rights lawyer with extensive experience in civic space issues arising in Africa. Prior to his joining Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, Ikechukwu has worked in advocacy and civic space team of Open Society Justice Initiative, where he facilitated initiatives aimed at resisting rising authoritarian tendencies around the world, supported efforts to protect international and regional human rights institutions, and he collaborated on strategic human rights litigation. Ikechukwu is an Abia State University alumnus. He graduated with first-class honors from the Nigerian Law School in Lagos in 2020. And before the law school, Ikechukwu was a legal researcher. Ikechukwu also obtained a master's degree in law from New York University Law School, where he worked with the Global Justice Clinic to respond to business and human rights issues arising out of Ghana and Kuyanga. Following Ikechukwu's LLM, Ikechukwu served as NYU's International Law and Human Rights Fellow at the Department of Peacekeeping Operations of the UN at the headquarters in New York. In this capacity, he worked on operationalizing the UN-supported Special Criminal Court in the Central African Republic. Ikechukwu is named as one of the 100 most influential young Nigerians in 2019 in recognition of his work on accountability for police brutality and impunity in Nigeria. Thank you and welcome to the chat, Ikechukwu.
Thanks again.
On the other hand, Philippe Plagbe is a Fulbright Fellow of 2021 and a human rights lawyer committed to developing expertise in democracy, international human rights, and international criminal law. His professional experience extends to almost 10 years of working with different international and local organizations, notably in Togo, West Africa, and the USA. Among other professional experiences, from 2017 to 2021, he was a human rights officer at the Human Rights Documentation and Training Center, where he coordinated a team of 30 defendants spread over the national territory in the documentation of human rights violations, legal assistance to right holders, and advocacy before UN and national human rights bodies. In 2020, he also worked with the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights as a consultant on trial monitoring in Togo, and in 2022 at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. Philip holds a Bachelor of Laws in Fundamental Private Law obtained at the University of Lome in Togo in 2017. He obtained a Master's of Law in International Legal Studies from the American University Washington College of Law. During his studies, he was the Dex Counsel of the university team at the JESOP competition, which is the largest multi-court competition on international law. Philip today is a project assistant at the National Democratic Institute, where his work focuses on DRC, Chad, and Central Africa, where he works to support democratic transitions, the realization of political reforms, and the professionalization of civil society. Welcome today, Philip, on the show.
Thank you, Joanna, for this generous presentation. Such a privilege to be here with you.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, and welcome to the chat. We're going to go straight into the first question, and that question would be for Ikechukwu. Ikechukwu, tell us, as a human rights lawyer in your work at Robert F. Kennedy, tell us how what your work is all about, and how has the pandemic affected your advocacy for human rights as a human rights lawyer? Yes.
Right. Thank you, Jacob. So, as I'll talk a bit about Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, about the work I do. Um, but I'd like to spend more time talking about, the impact of COVID-19 on civic space and democracy in Africa. And I'd explain why. So, at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, we work to continue the unfinished work of Robert F. Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1968. And since then, we've been working with local organizations across the world to pursue human rights and social justice. And in that connection, I work with a few colleagues to focus our efforts in Africa, but working strictly around civic space. That's the right to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. And in some countries, the right to freedom to the right to vote. And we work, just like I said, with local organizations who do most of the work and have the lived experience of engaging, with these issues on the continent. Of course, COVID affected everyone in different ways. Most specifically around, how people worked. So the structure of work changed. People worked from home and all of that. But as an international organization that does work under the leadership of domestic or local organizations on the continent, it didn't necessarily change the format or the mode or model of our work, because that's ultimately most of our work was done remotely, engaging through technology with partners on the ground. However, we noticed that, there was a marked there was marked impact of the more impact on our partners on the ground, who now had to face newer challenges or challenges that they had faced in times past, but now in more deeper, more with more intensity. So we had seen, at least from the last decade, a rise in attacks on civil society, attacks on online expression, attacks on journalists and the like. But we saw an uptick in these attacks during after March 2020, when the pandemic was, when the pandemic broke out. And we saw that there was like a transfer, in a sense, from the direct attacks on individuals, when they exercise their rights in person, to an online form of that similar attack. And it manifested in online internet shutdowns, some platform shutdowns, the growing of troll farms to attack people for what they said online, illegal surveillance and attempts to censor the media, even the rise of Pegasus to attack certain activists or certain individuals, and even a rise in arbitrary detention and the like. So what we saw predominantly was a movement from attacks that were mostly in person and direct to individuals to an online sphere that did not necessarily reduce the direct attacks, but just increased it and heightened it in terms of also extending those attacks to the family members of activists, the colleagues of certain activists that may not necessarily have been in the face of these attacks in times past. So we saw a heightening of human rights violations, a heightening of attacks on human rights defenders. But I'll close with this. We also saw the resistance of civil society and the strengthening of civic participation, especially in a country like Nigeria. And just to for everyone listening, we are focusing on West Africa today, and maybe at some point we'll be able to talk a bit about the geopolitics of West Africa. But Nigeria has almost 50% the population of West Africa, and you saw that the NSAS protest happened during COVID, but was not limited by COVID, because at the pressure that COVID put on the institutions of the state and the fact that those institutions couldn't bear that pressure, showed the citizens that their governments were weak and irresponsible. And so you saw protests, very organic protests like what we saw in Nigeria, that led to some investigations after the Lekki massacre, and led to the rebirth of civic participation, which we see now replicated in the efforts people are putting to be more involved in the political process ahead of the 2023 elections. So there were some positives and there were some negatives in terms of impact of COVID on the human rights environment generally, focused on activists on the one hand, but on the citizens and on individuals on the other hand.
All right, thank you very much, Ikechukwu. All right, Philip, please, we'd also like to know a little about what you do at the National Democratic Institute.
So I am a project assistant at the National Democratic Institute. That is an international organization supporting democracy and social justice across the world for many decades now. And my work is focused on DRC, Chad, and Central Africa, where I am working basically on three projects. One is focused on DRC, and we are trying towards the electoral process that is supposed to be thoroughly mature in 2023, the end of the year, to make sure that the necessary political reforms are realized and that there is a certain confidence between political actors to make sure that they go together to this electoral process, to have enough confidence and to have enough credibility and transparency. Then I'm working on Chad to make sure that we have a strong civil society platform to accompany the transition process that has been initiated since Idris Deby has died and a military regime is now in place. So it's very important that the transition that has been put in place finally is finished by a democratic regime. And I'm also working generally on Central Africa on another project where we rather focus on helping civil society to build capacities and resist the oppression of civil society. So this is actually my work at NDI. Coming back to the impact of COVID-19 on democracy and human rights in West Africa more precisely, I would say that there are maybe 3 or 4 kinds of impacts on democracy and human rights in West Africa when we talk about COVID-19. Just like Ikechukwu said, there was an introduction of very severe measures of restrictions on civic space by governments. And just like Ikechukwu said, just before the pandemic, there was this negative trend of shrinking of civic space because of state-sponsored measures using the pretext of political instability, terrorism, and security, and fight against misinformation to introduce some legislation and regulations that have negatively impacted civic space. And the pandemic has come as a justification uh, to these measures and even the reinforcement of these measures. And many of these countries in West Africa, if not all of them, have used state of emergency that gives to the executive power extraordinary powers in terms of legislation, in terms of restriction, in terms of derogation of human rights. So we have assisted to measures like lockdowns and curfews, where people were simply beaten, imprisoned, and even killed because they violated the measures, or even the fact that some journalists and citizens were imprisoned because they were criticizing the measures taken by the government, saying that they were spreading misinformation. The second category of impact is what we call a kind of blockage on the work of the civil society, because one of the problems with the pandemic is because of the measures to contain the pandemic. A lot of gatherings and a lot of social contact with the citizens with whom civil society will mainly work were severely curtailed. So civil society not only was very diminished in his capacity to reach out to citizens and to have some contacts with them, but they had to migrate on internet. And as you know, in Africa, access to internet is very difficult, and it's very dangerous because of some cyber attacks and some cyber threats. The third impact on human rights and democracy is the fact that many governments have used some internet tools to monitor the situation of COVID, and it has created some negative interference in what we call the privacy, the right to privacy of citizens. For instance, if you want to travel from a country to another country, you were supposed to register yourself on an application and or software, and nobody knows which kind of information are taken from you, with whom they are shared with. And the fourth impact is that from 2020 to now, there were many elections that were supposed to take place before the breakout and the spread of the COVID-19 disease. And you know that a credible and a transparent election is achieved when the political parties that are campaigning can reach out to the citizens and monitor the process. It was very difficult in this situation. Countries like Benin, Senegal, Togo, Burkina Faso, and many other countries could not have credible and transparent elections. Unfortunately, because the pandemic has severely diminished the possibility to come together as citizens and to engage thoroughly and fully in this electoral process, but also because the government has put in place some measures that have prevented the political parties to do so. So this can be a summary of the four categories of impact of COVID-19 on democracy and human rights.
Right. Thank you so much, Philippe, for taking us through that voyage of the impact in which the pandemic has caused as regards human rights. I'll turn to Ikechukwu now, taking from where you stopped. That's the NSAS protest in Nigeria, which is in West Africa, and also Philippe also made allusions into that. My next question will be: the pandemic came, is still much with us, but then can you specifically highlight the impact in which the pandemic has caused on the general economy of West Africa, and how, in turn, has this pandemic affected the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? Yes, I can.
Yeah, I think that the pandemic by itself, if we look at the numbers comparatively, may not have impacted Africa the way it impacted, America, the United States, or even other countries in in North and South America, and even in Europe, in terms of the numbers, in terms of the fatalities and the like, and again in terms of where things were before the pandemic hit. However, we note you would agree that in most parts of West Africa, the economies are either mono product economies. For example, in Nigeria, where the main product that runs the economy is crude oil, the sale of crude oil, and we have at a more local level, you have a teeming or a growing tech industry, and you have a growing entrepreneurial industry. Most of whom engage. Of course, there's also the part of the trading part, and that's part of the entrepreneurial part of our economy on the continent. And most of these non-government run industries depended hugely on imports. So with the COVID lockdowns, with the inaccessibility or the difficulty in accessing foreign exchange, and with the lack of leadership from the governments in the region, you found that there was a difficulty generally to run businesses. There was a difficulty for even the state to run the state based, or the state businesses. And so you saw that there was pressure, just like I said earlier, on the entire structure of governance, with the delay and the difficulty in shipping. We saw all those issues with raw materials for production that were delayed, and because of the delay and the rise in demand, the prices went up. We saw that reflect in commodities within the countries, where certain staple commodities, including food, became very expensive, and the government had no response. So you saw that there was a direct impact, definitely, on the economy, and that direct impact passed through in the U.S. For example, there were all sorts of stimulus packages to make up for the impact, their impact of COVID and the pandemic on individuals. But you didn't see similar things happening in West Africa, right? There was just a sense of irresponsibility. That's how well, and the lack of innovation to respond to the pandemic. And so people literally had to fend for themselves. And we saw the very disgusting sights of even some of the internationally sourced palliative items stockpiled by some government entities in different warehouses in different parts of exile. For example, in Nigeria, which during the NSAS protests, people found some of these places, and the looting was going on, and the like, and all of that. So you saw a government system, or a system of governance that couldn't withstand the pressure, and that pressure passed directly to the individuals, and it was impossible. It was difficult to coordinate a response. And so that was that and these aspects of poor governance existed before COVID. But with COVID, with the pandemic, they were exacerbated, and they were revealed. It was very clear that there was no ability to adapt to such a dire situation. And so, but in terms of the sustainable development goals, we could see that there was a broad impact, and it may have stalled, in a sense, certain efforts that were made to push on some of those goals. But I think, for the most part, what is useful is the fact that it also served as a point for everyone to pause and and reflect on exactly what it was that states were doing in terms of governance, and to reimagine the contribution of citizens and groups of citizens, including civil society, in fulfillment of those goals, and even breaking those goals down to a part to a point where it makes sense for the average man on the street or average woman on the street. Because for the most part, when we talk about these goals in the language that they've been couched, it makes sense from a goal standpoint, but it really and truly doesn't reflect similarly in terms of how individuals in some of these countries, especially in West Africa, we are experiencing their lives between the the MDGs and the transition to SDGs. It was the problems remained the same. And so I think provided an opportunity to test the systems, and when the systems couldn't strongly adapt to the challenges, I think there was a natural response to push back on those systems, and hopefully that process leads to stronger systems that can lead us to the achievement of the sustainable development goals. And so what I like to take out of the pandemic in terms of its impact on development, its impact on human rights protection, its impact on civic participation, is that it provided a real life opportunity to see the failings in systems, and hopefully those failings will be plugged in a few years to come.
All right, thank you very much, Ikechukwu, on that insight on the achievement of our sustainable development goals. So now over to you, Philip. You're from Togo. Would like to know basically your own experience about the effects of COVID on the economy in your country. So just give us shed light on that for us.
To go straight to the goal, Togo, as many countries in Africa, has been shaken by COVID because the country was not prepared to such a crisis. Even if, on contrary to some Western countries, the impact of COVID in terms of contaminations were less. In Togo, where we're just having something like 1,000 cases. Maybe in a month or even more. Uh, it was very difficult, especially for small businesses to survive, because small businesses survive by having some very direct and close contact with the citizens and the clients. And where we are in a situation of lockdowns, especially in the nights, where these small businesses thrive and have their activities, it is very, very difficult for these small businesses to continue to have their activities and to continue to have their day-to-day incomes and keep on actually living. These small businesses, especially, did not receive a direct support from the government, even if there was a fund that was put in place by the government that was supposed to be a fund of 400 millions of French CFA to make sure that these small businesses are supported. Unfortunately, it was just a fund, and it was just very, very, it was a planning. The government was never able to gather such a money, even from big banks in the country, Togolese or African or even international banks. So many of the measures that were put in place actually were simply not achieved. And also, thirdly, the only measures, sorry, that were effective was the fact that there was a kind of exoneration or delay in the payment of the taxes for the small businesses, but they could not really it was not a very efficient measure to make sure that these small businesses continue to survive. The second problem that occurred in the country regarding the economy and COVID-19 is that it was the scarcity of the basic items, not only the scarcity, but the fact that they were very expensive, because at the same time many businesses were closed, many organizations were closed, people actually lost their jobs, lost their income sources, but at the same time they still have to live, they still have to buy these items. And because of the international shortage of these basic items and the difficulty to have access to them, it was very difficult for people to keep on living decently, to keep on actually surviving. And the government has introduced a program to support vulnerable people. It was a kind of program where monthly they will receive some money to support them, but the money that was actually provided was so little that, please, with a permission, I wouldn't even mention that amount of money. But it was a very good program anyway that was promoted, and that was actually uploaded by many organizations. So just to let you know that COVID had a very bad effect on Togo's economy, and has basically shaken the country. And until now, it's very difficult for Togolese people to recover from the crisis, even if we hopefully believe it is behind us.
Thank you so much, Philip, for that. The next question would actually be a build up on what both of you have said, and this will go to the issue of the right to work and inclusion. You all will agree with me that when the pandemic struck, many organizations, businesses, education transitioned from in person into online. And then you'd recall that we have so many human beings who are physically challenged. Some cannot even use computers, and then their workplaces provided some of these resources and then platforms for them to be able to work and then create an uninclusive, like, sorry, to create an inclusive environment. Now, I can tell me for those who are physically challenged, who could not move around, sorry, who could move around, but then do not have these basic things to work from home, how do you think the pandemic had actually affected their right to work and to earn a decent living as a human during the pandemic and when the lockdowns were being enforced by different governments?
Yeah, I think that again, the concept of the right to work, and we are talking about West Africa particularly, you know, uh, the governments will shy away from assuming obligations or responsibility for the right to work, and there will be arguments around the fact that social and economic rights are non-justiciable, and we'll have all those parts of the constitution that look towards aspirations, or the fact that each government will work towards ensuring equitable the right to work, and but however, the right to dignity of persons, and the right to the right to dignity of persons, which also impacts in terms of equality and the protection against discrimination is important in this context. And so, what we saw with COVID, just like I've said over and over, is that it tested systems, and it showed that systems were weak, or were not prepared. And so, for individuals who living with disability, uh, uh, in so many cases, they they couldn't operate, or they couldn't work, and in most cases they lost their jobs, and it was the same across board. And because again, there's a problem of documentation, there's a problem of really going down to the granular aspects of the economy. There was no analysis to really know how many people lost their jobs, to know how that impacted the economy. That's an aspect of governance, writ large across the sub region, that we don't really focus on, because people were not paying attention to individuals and how the pandemic affected individuals. If there was any attention paid on individuals, it was to ensure that the restrictions were observed. But beyond that, there was very little done, including in terms of ensuring that people were able to work and earn a living wage. Different private organizations or private companies and had, just like you said, some made efforts to provide, facilities for working from home and facilities for ensuring that some of their staff that living with disability were able to still continue to earn a living wage and were still able to work. We found instances where the entire workflow was revised, and people were able to move from doing certain things that they could only do in person to doing certain things online, even if they were just clerical. But this happened in piecemeal and in specific instances led by private corporations that had that took up that responsibility. But from the standpoint of the government, that was lacking. And so while COVID-19 impacted the economy at large in terms of the reduction or the increase in unemployment, and individuals in terms of earning wages and being able to run their lives and continue living their lives, including to purchase medication when they caught the virus, or had other medical conditions. More so, it impacted people living with disability. And while in some countries, like in Nigeria, after a long drawn battle, the law to protect people living with disability was passed, the follow up steps to actually implement those laws in different countries had not been built up enough to operate effectively during the pandemic. So just like before the pandemic, you know, people living with disabilities fared even worse during the pandemic. And these are things that I am not comfortable for us to just talk about. I'm I'm eager for us to learn from what has happened and review and revise the way we operate our societies, because if that is not done, then we wouldn't have learned from what was really consequential and more negative than positive pandemic and experience. Our government must learn from what has happened and start to build structures to change that, particularly focused on the vulnerable people, including people living with disabilities.
All right. Thank you very much, Ikechukwu. Okay, Philip, you work at the NDI, which is a civil society. Could you please tell us the role of civic society groups in terms of programs to address the impact of COVID-19 so far? What programs and what steps have been placed by most civil societies just to address this issue?
The first one is to provide the information because the COVID 19 pandemic is one of a kind. I'm not sure that the world has ever known such actually a pandemic, and its impact on human rights, just like we have recalled at the beginning, was completely very bad. So it was very important for civil society to start providing information on how to prevent this disease and how the citizens actually can organize and make sure that they can resist the repression of civic space and the human rights. And this actually has been the first thing that civil society has started actually doing. The second thing is to monitor the human rights situation, because the documentation of the human rights violations were very, very important to make sure that the governments and the international community understand how COVID-19 was used to justify a lot of human rights abuses. So a lot of organizations have gone into monitoring the situations of human rights in the framework of the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. And the documentation of these human rights violations have been really helpful in discussing with the government about the measures that were taken, and actually to make sure that if there was if there was prove violations, there was supposed to be reparation and justice, but also to make sure that there was a reorientation of the policies that were taken by the government. Also, civil society, just as Ikechukwu said, was very instrumental in thinking the after COVID based on the experience of the COVID, because COVID came to give us lessons about how our countries are functioning. When the COVID happened in most of the countries in West Africa, the legislations, the political infrastructures were not just prepared to face this kind of pandemic. And the civil society actually has made some analysis on how to make sure that the legislations, the institution, and the policies are now taken to make sure that if this kind of issue happen again, then we should actually be ready. And to finish, civil society has really been, especially youth people, instrumental in finding innovative ways to cope with the pandemic, because it was completely impossible for our health infrastructures, for instance, to welcome all those who were sick of COVID or even sick of other sicknesses. It was completely impossible for small businesses to keep on working. Ikechukwu just talked about the way that it was very difficult for people to migrate on internet in terms of work. I wanted even to say that before you can access the internet, you need to have the internet. And the rate of penetration of internet in our countries is so little that I'm not sure that it was very easy for people when they were saying that school are going online, jobs are going online, to even buy the connection, to even have access especially in remote areas of our countries. So civil society has played a role in bringing up innovative ways to keep on living, even if it was very difficult to live in this pandemic, and to think the future. So this is what India has been supporting some of this work, even if we are not the only partner of civil society in Africa. There are so many of them that are doing great work, including RFK. So yeah.
All right. Okay. Yes. On that note, Kechuku, please, could also still on the same question, can you tell us what Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights is actually doing to address this issue?
So in terms of, I think that broadly speaking, um, just like I said at the outset, the challenges that were exacerbated or came to the fore because of the pandemic were existing in certain forms before the pandemic. So what we have done at RFK Human Rights was to start immediately the pandemic broke, to monitor the media, to identify cases of violations of human rights that had heightened because of the pandemic. You know, in line with what Philip said, you know, documentation of human rights violations is a very important uh, component of, you know, the work to protect and promote human rights. So we started running that media monitoring, weekly media monitoring effort in January of 2020, and have continued it up until, you know, this week. And through those cases, through that process of media monitoring, we identified a few cases of and, you know, like, it's wrong to say a few cases. We identified so many cases on a weekly basis of human rights violations affecting individuals as citizens, affecting uh, journalists, affecting civil society organizations, and the like. And in response to some of those cases, for example, in a case in Egypt, we filed a petition before the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and we are able, in this case, it involved a student who was arrested on his way when he returned to Egypt uh, because of a post he made on social media. We are able to get a positive decision in his case from the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and our hope is that one of the hearings coming up on Monday, that he would be released and he would be able to return to his life. We are able also to support the Twitter ban case before the ECOWAS court as Amici Courier, and that case was challenging the government's the government's restriction of access to Twitter. There were other cases that we've intervened, including that of a writer who was arrested and tortured in Uganda, and there are other cases. So we've heightened our engagement with local organizations, keeping in touch with them and learning what's going on, trying to highlight their work internationally. And I'll stop at this. Recently, we recognized two Cameroon human rights advocates, Felix Abobala and Maximilian Gombe, who have been working in Cameroon before COVID and during COVID and now in the post-restriction era to support human rights. So we've been doing a mix of things from advocacy to strategic litigation to capacity building. We organized multiple webinars during that period to train people on strategic litigation and how to use regional mechanisms. So there's been a broad range of efforts to support the work of civil society from RFK Human Rights. I think
All
most
right.
of the work has been done by these organizations in these countries who, when the countries shut down, did not shut down their work. They kept working to ensure that human rights were protected.
Okay, thank you very much, Ikechukwu. Thank you so much for such insights today on the show. Thank you also, Philip. It's a pleasure having you on the show today. Okay, over to you, Jacob, in Washington, D.C.
All right, thank you very much, Philip and Ikechukwu and Joanna. Ladies and gentlemen, we've now come to the end of the show. I've been speaking to Ikechukwu Uzoma, who's an international human rights lawyer and currently a staff attorney at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. He's also been joined by Philippe Plagbe. Philippe Plagbe is a Fulbright Fellow 2021 and currently working as a project assistant at the National Democratic Institute in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, we're unable to take questions from our viewers online. We have several questions, but we're running out of time. I would like to thank everyone for being
This is terrible. This is terrible. We've been talking about human rights and freedom of expression, and then we are unable
Can we take
to
one
give
or
a,
two questions?
yeah. Can we take, because it will be really sad to.
Okay, sure. There's a question on LinkedIn. The person says, Philip, can you tell us practically about what the government is doing to address the issue of human rights abuse in Togo?
So when I was in Togo, the government has put in place a platform that has gathered the state institutions, the ministerial department, and civil society to discuss the human rights violations and abuses. And it was actually a platform that was put in place in which there were two civil society organizations, and I was representing one where we were supposed to monitor the situations, discuss the violations, and talk about the solutions. So it was a good initiative in terms of thinking this kind of platform. That it is useless to tell you that unfortunately the reports were drafted but never implemented, just like what our usual governments would do. They will come up with good ideas, and when you come recommendations and actions, it will actually never be implemented. So this is actually one of the second thing the government has been trying to do, is to kind of inform the population about what is COVID-19, or what is state of emergency, what can be the impact on human rights. But on the same hand, in my opinion, the government has not respected the requirements that were supposed to be in place when you use state of emergency in terms of the pandemic. as taking a special law that is supposed to design the perimeter of the powers of the executive, what can be the role of the parliament and the justice, and what actually are supposed to be the sanctions to those who will be the perpetrators of human rights violations. Such law was never taken. So
Thank
just to tell you that the ideas the government has tried to inject were good when thinking them, but they were never implemented, and we're still expecting the government to move from ideas to actions.
Right. Thank you so much, Felipe. Then this question is from one of our viewers on Twitter, and it says, "Can you ask Mr. Sorry, his name is Ikechukwu Uzoka, not Udoma. Uzoma." He said, "Can you ask Mr. Ikechukwu Uzoma, would you rather prefer people to have been walking around during the pandemic rather than asking them to stay at home during the lockdown? Can we say this is indeed a breach of human rights, or we are just romancing words as it were?"
Of course, we are not romancing words, and the truth is that this was a pandemic. No government in the world was prepared for it. However, government is set up to respond to challenges, and this was a test for government. And so I never made any reference to the lockdowns not being in line with human rights, but most times the enforcement of those of the lockdowns were not carried on side by side with steps to ensure that people who were locked down could continue to live their lives. You have the families who have a family of 8 people living together in a space of, let's say, 50 square meters, and usually they would just spend the night together. Everybody leaves to school and people go to work and only come back to spend a few hours together, and they're like, now they had to spend 24 hours, weeks and months together alone. For some people who lost their jobs, that is where you would expect the government to come in with some efforts to provide food, to provide sustenance, to ensure that pregnant women had access to healthcare, stuff like that. So all that was lacking was that sense of responsibility, and governments who rose to the occasion. So I, by no means, I never said that the lockdowns were a restriction of movements that were not in line with human rights. The
Right.
point I was making was that it was a challenge, and we expected governments to rise to the occasion, and they didn't to the extent that people expected them to. However, now is the time to build structures so that in the future we don't have a repeat when we have another challenge.
Thank you very much, Ikechukwu. Thank you again, Joanna, and thank you, Philip, for coming to share your thoughts today on the topic, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, civic space, and democracy in West Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll see you next week on the chat. It's been nice and chatting with you, and have a good weekend. Welcome to the Human Rights Cafe. My name is Jacob Sule. When people's rights are tampered with or denied, it means that my rights and yours are being undermined. Hence, we must educate people about their rights.